Blessings, beloveds. Welcome back. Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer. Just want to talk about a few more things to consider about this solar eclipse, which is just a day away. So today's the 8th of June for me here in the Southern Hemisphere. For you guys, it'll be the 7th. So we're really approaching the intensity of this eclipse. And because of the nature of events still being so utterly confusing, not a lot of transparency as to what's truth, what's real, what isn't, what's hidden, what are the secrets, who's in control, who's doing what. I think this eclipse really encapsulates a lot of those anxieties and concerns and uncertainties for all of us around the entire globe, really. And so some of the things that I looked at was relative to this particular solar eclipse. Something that I forgot to mention in the previous video, which is why I decided to do this video today, is that a good exercise is to look back 19 years ago, because these eclipses run through cycles of every 18, 19 years, depending on leap years. That would be what would make the adjustment to 18 or 19 years, but generally 18 to 19 years. Now, some of you might not be old enough to go back that far, and many of you will be. So it is something to be aware of regardless of your age anyway, especially if you're working with astrology. So I just had a look at my own chart relative to this current eclipse and what happened 19 years ago, because I am at that age where I can look back, and I found it actually very, very interesting in terms of what it shows up for me. And I won't go into the details of that, I won't bore you with my life story, but I have to say that there appears to be corresponding patterns and themes, I suppose you could say, that are reflected back in time and are being reflected again in the present. But one thing I want to say, because we as human beings, as souls, the primary purpose is to evolve. So when we are working with planetary cycles and looking at our chart and going back and then sort of progressing forward to the present and so forth, it's always good to remember that, well, we're evolving, right? So we are at a different stage, a different age in life relative to the cycle we are looking at. And so naturally what happened 19 years ago is not going to be identical as to what happens now, but there will be a theme that perhaps you might be able to recognize. This is specifically the case if this solar eclipse, which is at, say, around about 20 degrees of Gemini, if that's hitting off one of the angles in your chart, so the ascendant, the descendant, the IC or the MC, so the cross of matter in your chart, the four angles, which, as I always say, they are like 100% voltage points. They are very, very, very powerful points in the chart. When they are activated in your chart, whether it's through an eclipse or something else, there is almost always a particular theme or event that actually shows up for you. So it's good to pay attention to what hits off your angles. And that's also another very good way to work out whether your time of birth is right or not, right? So 19 degrees or 20 degrees of Gemini, is that hitting off, one of those angles in your chart? Is it perhaps where your sun is, or your moon, or your Venus, or your Mars? Really look at the personal planets to start with and the angles. Of course, the other planets also are very important and can absolutely show up events and themes. But when it comes to the transpersonal planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron for that matter, it is always a lot more difficult to pinpoint and personalize, as it were. Although with Pluto, I have to say that it seems to be quite personalized when Pluto hits something off in the chart. It's just a different ball game with Pluto altogether. I think that's partly because it represents the soul, right? Especially in evolutionary astrology. But certainly, if you've got something, at 19, 20 degrees of Gemini, or Sagittarius, the opposite sign, You can look at squares as well. So the squares would be to Pisces and Virgo. So you're looking at the mutable energies in your chart, because it's the mutable energy that's being activated right through this solar eclipse, and also just through the other transiting planets at the moment. We have Jupiter in Pisces, we have Neptune in Pisces, Mercury's in Gemini, the solar eclipse is in Gemini. These are all mutable signs, and the only one that's not being emphasized at the moment is Virgo. However, it's still there in the zodiac, right? I think Vesta is the one that's in Virgo at the moment. So just have a look at where that 20-degree mark is in your chart relative to mutable signs. And then, of course, the other thing that you can start to practice, if you haven't already, is just looking at the midpoint structures, in your chart. So you might not have any planets at, 19, 20 degrees of Gemini or Sag, Pisces or Virgo, which are the four mutable signs. You might, however, have a very important midpoint structure at any of those signs at around about 20 degrees of, Gemini, Sag, Pisces, Virgo. And I guess it's important to perhaps bring that up and just show you. I've got some interesting things to talk about here other than just the solar eclipse that I just want to kind of throw into the mix, because I just find it fascinating. So let's just go to the current eclipse chart. Okay, so this is the eclipse that's happening, 10th of June for us in the Southern Hemisphere, and 9th of June for you guys in the Northern Hemisphere. Regardless, this is the degree over here. You can see the North Node, the Sun and the Moon. You can see it's a solar annular eclipse, so it's not a total eclipse, it's an annular eclipse. And visually we can see that by the fact that the North Node is around about almost 9 degrees away from the Sun and the Moon. That's what shows us that it's not an exact solar eclipse. For example, if it was an exact solar eclipse, and that node would be virtually to the same degree, or the same degree, right? So that's how you can identify these things as well, just visually when you're looking at them. Now, okay, so before I go there, as I said, pretend this was your own chart, okay, just for the sake of the demonstration that I want to give at the moment. If you're working with SolarFire, you would go to the right-hand side where you see all these tab selections. You would hit reports, okay, and it brings up this particular window, which opens up on this page to begin with. And as you look at this window on the right-hand side, there are all these options that you can go to, which show different things. And what you want to look at here is something called midpoint listing. So if this was your birth chart, this is the same thing you would do, okay? So you would hit midpoint listing. You want to make sure that you've got 360 degrees modulus in this section here. I'll just point and drop the arrow down. As you can see, it gives you all these other options, okay, of how you can divide the circle. But we want 360 degrees in place because we want to be able to see every single midpoint with every single body, asteroid, and point in the chart. So that's what this enables us to do. It starts off with the order of the planets. As you can see, it starts with the moon. So there's the moon with all the possible midpoints relative to the moon sun, moon Vulcan, because I have Vulcan in the chart, moon Mercury, moon Venus, moon Mars, and so on. And then if you scroll down, you can see it goes to the sun, then it goes to Vulcan, and then it just continues right through this wave, right, of columns. And so when you're looking at this first half of the section, because I'll show you there's another section down below, but in this section here, if you want to, say for example, you're thinking to yourself, what's the midpoint of my sun and moon? If you can't, just calculate it with your naked eyes, because some people won't be able to, and in some cases it might not be so easy. So you would just simply bring up this midpoint page, and you would just go to sun, moon. And because we are using the solar eclipse, chart as an example, well, the sun moon midpoint is 19 because there's a sun moon conjunction here, right? So we know that's the midpoint. But just pretend this was your own chart. This is what you would do if you want to know what's the midpoint between my Pluto Chiron. Well, there's Pluto Chiron there. It shows you it's 4 degrees Pisces in 23 minutes, if this was your chart, right? The other way to also look at midpoint structures, now you want to look at where is 19 degrees, does 19 degrees of Gemini or Sagittarius or Virgo or Pisces, the four mutable signs, do those degrees fall into any important midpoint structures in my chart? Because like I said, this solar eclipse may not be hitting off one of your angles. It may not be hitting off one of your personal planets. And you might think, it's not really hitting anything off. It's not really that significant for me. Well, not entirely correct. You can actually look at if it's hitting off a very important midpoint structure. And there are many midpoint structures in the chart, and some speak more loudly to you than others. It just depends on you and the overall structure of your chart and, the story to your life and your evolution and all those things, of course. So you'd scroll down and now you can see that it's got sorted by angle modulus 360 degrees. So that's just showing you the entire 360 degrees of the zodiac, starting from Aries, of course, because that's where the zodiac begins. And it just goes through all the degrees of the zodiac, and it shows you what is at the midpoint of any particular degree. So we want to, let's just say this was your chart, and you want to see, is there anything at 19 degrees? Well, there's at the midpoint of Moon Mercury is actually 20 degrees of Gemini, because we're using the solar eclipse chart as an example. Okay, so if this was your chart, you'd know that 20 degrees of Gemini is actually at the midpoint of your Moon and Mercury. That's a pretty important midpoint. Okay, and so therefore you would say to yourself, okay, so this solar eclipse is hitting off the midpoint of my Moon and Mercury in my chart. And so then you start looking at, well, where is Mercury in my chart? Where is the Moon? What houses do they rule? How does this sort of start to synthesize some kind of theme for me relative to the meaning of a solar eclipse and this particular solar eclipse? So that's kind of how you would start to work with it, right? So yeah, in other words, pay attention to where 19, 20 degrees of Gemini, Sag, Pisces, Virgo are, if they are hitting anything off in your chart. Next, you would go to midpoints. You can also go to midpoints even if it is hitting things off in your chart, just to observe and see if there are any midpoints being hit off. The other thing to consider is what I said in the previous video, that fundamentally this solar eclipse, fortunately, has a really good description associated to it. It comes from a really positive cycle of eclipses relative to Bernadette Brady's work. And like I've always said, I highly regard and value what she has to say because she's pretty much spot on each time. Needless to say, though, that this eclipse, we can see here that it's forming a square to Neptune. And this is, I think, the component, as I said in my previous video, that's the more difficult component, because that just brings up all the issues of lies, truth, disillusionment, disappointment, despair, uncertainty. It's just such a big fog at the moment out there in the world, with the weaving of data and apparent events that are taking place. There's no transparency. There's total, utter confusion. And, just to bring in Mr. Anthony Fauci, who is, all over the news at the moment, has been for a little while, but he's been really honed in on at the moment because of allegations that he has misinformed the public, and he has lied on numerous occasions, and so he's been investigated at the moment. And whilst he's not a politician, he's a pretty powerful figure relative to his position in society and what he represents and what he's brought to the world. And he's got a Mercury square Neptune in his chart. And I'm going to show a repetitive theme about Mercury-Neptune in a minute. So I guess even though this solar eclipse, represents so many beautiful aspects relative to intuition and, the mystic and the dreaming and psychic downloads and psychic insights and all the beautiful components of life that can bring a different level of experience and inner fulfillment, that is actually that it's inner, it's from the inside levels of our beingness, of our consciousness, of our psychic centers and fields. And it's all beautiful and fine and dandy, but we are still standing here faced with a reality before us that is extremely uncertain in terms of where it's heading. There's no end in sight with the current events, and the anxiety, frustration, pressure, lack of freedom, lack of sovereignty, all those things that people are feeling is, it's vibrating a frequency on the entire Earth plane, and it's not helping any of us. The more we all tune into the fear and the uncertainty, which I know is hard not to, the more we do that, however, and give more energy and focus and attention to that, the more that energy just vibrates on the earth plane, and everyone is influenced by it. So that's why I posted that video on my community section, from William Meader, who is an esoteric astrologer, and I think he's great with esoteric astrology, especially. His understanding of esoteric astrology is brilliant. And his message, through that video, in short, was just essentially that the crisis before us is, represented through so many levels, astrologically, astronomically, through these cycles that are occurring, namely Saturn, Pluto, the conjunction between those two planets, which was, has been hitting really hard, last year and even up to early this year. And anyway, so he pointed to, a lot of the cycles and so forth. But finally, his message was that these changes are clearly inevitable, and there's so many layers of things that we still cannot see. And the more we focus on the fear-based feelings and thoughts that rise within us, which are the lower astral chakras, you could say, the lower centers of our being, which we all have those, but the more we get sort of sucked into that, the more we create this energy around the earth plane that it how can I put it? It's there's so many ways of explaining this and so many ways of perceiving it and interpreting it, but there seems to be this intense conflict of light and dark, you could say. And so there's this face off, and the really big changes need to happen, and they are happening. And there's this enormous resistance that's going on, and the resistance is happening, energetically, spiritually, with the actual celestial bodies. For example, Uranus forming a square to Saturn. We're just about to step into the second square, I think, tomorrow. We had the first square earlier this year, and then we have another one towards the end of the year. So 2021 is just as critical and difficult as 2020. That's obvious when we just look around at life, right? We can all see that and feel that. And it's the old story with Saturn-Uranus that it's the consensus reality, the establishment versus the rest of humanity, and the rest of humanity, which is more inclined to oppose the establishment. It's a smaller portion of people. It's a minority, because if it was the majority, we'd we'd be seeing very different things taking play, I think. So anyway, the the consensus reality establishment is always going to try to control the Uranian impulse, which is freedom, authenticity, revelation, liberation, and so forth. And so these two are squaring each other off. You go back to the mythology, Saturn castrated Uranus. Um, that's pretty severe, right? Imagine castrating somebody. And so it just goes back to the old psychological story of Saturn in the 3D reality, because there are higher levels to the expression of Saturn when you go into esoteric astrology, and even old medieval astrology has some references to Saturn as being the magician. It's Saturn is the wise one, the teacher, the magician, when it's operating from those really higher healthy levels. But when it's operating at the everyday mundane level, which it is in this 3D world, it's operating from that level of control. It sort of it kind of suffocates the life out of people. That's how Saturn operates on that 3D sort of reality. So here we have, the square between Saturn and Uranus. So the old battle that's been going on as long as there's been life, really. And obviously that has changed, through history and different times and so forth. And now we are getting a different version of this, you could say, relative to where we are now in history, in time. So these energies are, incredibly conflicting and challenging and troubling for all of us, particularly with what's going on, right, with the nature of events. Um, so where was I going with that? I guess I was just trying to say that in listening to a lot of people share their thoughts and reflections, whether it's astrologically or philosophically or spiritually, it is clear that everyone is subjected to this same paradigm at the moment, and it is pretty hard to stay uplifted. It is pretty hard to stay optimistic because everything just looks so bleak at the moment, right? And I totally get it. It's really bleak where I am at the moment. Trust me. It's like it's winter. It's freezing cold. Everyone's in lockdown. It's just the most. It's like I'm literally living in like a deja vu, right? What's that movie called? Groundhog Day with Bill Murray, movie from back in the 80s. Because the experience of the energy of what appears in place of the world where I am is the exact repeat of what we experienced last year in winter. There's absolutely no difference. We've just, it's like we've regressed back into that exact same experience. It's just really, it's so difficult to process, even logically. Not a lot is making sense. This is the Mercury squaring Neptune, by the way, and Mercury is retrograde. Now, I've also found that on a positive level, Mercury retrograde, for me anyway, I can only speak for myself, I can't speak for you guys, right? But I'm sharing this because I'd be interested to hear perhaps your reflections and perhaps some of your experiences. Mercury retrograde for me, even though it's only been retrograde, about a week or so, I've it's been a really powerful retrograde cycle for me, and the adjustments and rethinking of things that I've made in very important components of my life, and I've made some pretty significant changes that would be described by Mercury, of course, because Mercury is the thought processes and rethinking things, right? Rethinking, reevaluating, readjusting. It's all the re words, right? And I've gone through some pretty significant changes that has the the way it was instigated was so intuitive for me. It wasn't like I sat there and created a list, for example, and looked at pros and cons, or that would be a Virgo type of thing. This was a very intuitive process that was actually happening in my sleep and in my dreams. And there's been a couple of times where I've woken up through a particular dream I had, or a very strong intuitive sense I had, and I acted on that intuition instantly. It was about 5 in the morning for one of those types of situations, and that was me really tuning into the messages that I was receiving about what I needed to act on. And the things that I acted on, as I said, were very important components of my life story, journey, etc. So I just wonder how Mercury retrograde has been for you guys on that. So I see that as a really positive change for me, right, moving forward in my life. Um, but, like I said, this Neptune is squaring all these Gemini components down here. And it is a really tricky and surreal kind of time, if you like, from the level of what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what to believe, what not to believe. And, we're right in the eclipse energy at the moment. So the energies are super, 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 super amplified, right? Intensified. And, historically, solar eclipses have never really been classed as a good omen. They've always been viewed as something that really just brings cataclysmic type of events, and we're yet to see exactly what there has been some highlights so far. For example, for us, this eclipse is connected to the lockdown we've gone into, the Mars-Pluto opposition. That now Mars is moving away from this opposition, but it was active for the last week or so, and we had a lot of sort of uproar here in the streets of the city that I live in with citizens and the police force, relative to the vaccination and things like that. There's been quite intense sort of confrontations that have taken place, and there's been people assaulted and people arrested, and all that sort of stuff's gone on. And so the Mars Pluto has kind of amplified all of that in amongst building up towards a solar eclipse. So that's probably playing out in different ways, obviously, in different countries and different cities. It's a world, it's a collective transit, right? But I'm just speaking to some of the highlights that I've been able to observe, right, because of where I live. I can't sort of do that for every single country, because then I'd be here for hours and hours and hours. So I hope you can appreciate that. So the next thing I want to just quickly show you is so some of you were not even born at this time. Some of you may have just been born. Some of you may have been born, many years before this time. So you need to obviously look at this yourself. But what I'm pointing to is 1983. So that was 40 years ago, right? Bit longer than that. So you can see that this is the repetition, right, of this cycle of eclipses. And so these eclipses are referred to as Saros cycles. And Saros means repetition, actually, right? And so it comes from some Greek individual who came up with that word, I think it was. Let me just recap my notes there. Just doing some further reading from Bernadette Brady on just some articles I found online. Yeah, the Saros series or cycles by the Greek lexicographer Suidas in the 10th century CE. The word Saros meaning repetition or to be repeated. So each Saros series produced a solar eclipse every 18 to 19 years, which is what I was saying before, which is why what we're doing is we're just going back. We're going back 2 cycles for this video, at least, just to see some of the energies because some of you might be at an age where you can actually go this far back, right? And so if you do, then what you would look at is you'd look at, okay, well, in 1983, there's the solar eclipse at 19 of Gemini, and you can see the node is at 25, and you can see that this one was actually a total solar eclipse. All right, so we know that total has a more intensified energy, right? And it's also visually, it's a total solar eclipse, so visually it appears differently as well. And so here you can see that, as I was referencing earlier, that the node would be much closer to the sun and the moon, right? That's what makes it a total solar eclipse. And so what is it? It's about 4 degrees away, thereabouts, right? So very close. And we can see that Mars is here. Okay. Um, I would actually consider Neptune in an opposition to this eclipse, even though some might say that's too wide. I wouldn't. I'd say no, that's there. You know, it's 8 degrees away or so, right? That's not too far. Okay, that's definitely in opposition. So in other words, Neptune is there in this theme again. So just note that in your mind. Mars is there as well. And Mars Neptune is probably one of the more challenging aspects. Corresponds to ray number 6 in esoteric astrology. It's a very problematic planetary pair of energies in the when it is expressed through the personality in this 3D reality. You know, it's deception, it's deceptive behavior, deceptive action. It's the the fanatical religious group or community or persons that would hold a belief that their religious doctrines are the only way, it's the only truth. You know, it's all that sort of stuff, right? So it's what can create a lot of division, right, and conflict and war, basically. So anyway, that's more of a broader collective sort of view. But in terms of your own personal self, you'd be thinking about, okay, so there's a theme here with Neptune. So if you think back to 1983, if you were around then and what was happening in your life, if you can, remember that far back. Okay, so yeah, and if we go forward to 2002, which was about 19 years ago, this is the same theme, right? The repetition, sorrow cycle, as the one that we are looking at and in today, right? So this too has a pretty challenging sort of energies around it. It's basically conjunct Saturn and it's opposite Pluto. And Mars Neptune is an incredibly challenging signature, and so is Pluto Saturn. And we know that because when we look at the Pluto Saturn cycles through history, there's been pretty trying times that have happened historically, on the Earth plane, and the one that we are in now, which is with this global health situation, is largely connected to Pluto Saturn, largely connected to the Pluto Saturn conjunction that we've had for quite some time. So, this solar eclipse is showing us that there's a Saturn Pluto opposition. So, it's a pretty challenging eclipse that's happened here as well. This doesn't mean that it has to be, entirely disastrous and it's all, negative things. I'm just pointing to the energies that are there, and we can't deny that, they are challenging. We just simply cannot deny that. So, just have a think about what was happening in your life in 2002. So, you see here, you're looking at the same degree again. It's virtually 20 degrees of Gemini, right? 19 degrees, 54 minutes. So, this is the same cycle again back in 2002. Um, and coming back to the present again, here we are today, or virtually today. There it is again at 19 degrees, 47 minutes. And this time, Neptune is forming a square. So Neptune is in the picture again. Pluto is, you could say it's in the picture if you want to add the inconjunct aspect. Okay, it's actually in conjunct this solar eclipse. So we can add that and say it's there because it is. But certainly the square from Neptune is the one that's, I think, holding the primary theme to what's appearing collectively. But when you go back to your own chart, just have a look at 19 degrees of Gemini, Sag, Pisces, Virgo. As I said, see if those points are prominent in your chart, with if you've got planets there or if it's any of your angles. As I said, look at midpoint structures as well. And think about the last couple of cycles. If you're not old enough, that's fine. Just observe the current one. And just remember that even though it is pretty challenging, Bernadette Brady did say about this particular eclipse that, again, it holds a really powerful offering where people can actually creatively act on what's being offered through the processes of spirituality, imagination, psychic insights, and sudden flashes of insight. So, what can come through for you now can be very, very powerful in your journey on those levels. So, it's not to be underestimated, even though everything mostly out there seems pretty shit, pretty difficult. There is this other component, which is just reflective of the component of our life, which is inner, right? It's got nothing to do with what's going on out there. If we can, find ways to continuously nurture the inner dimension of our experience of reality inside us, we can develop a greater sense of center where when chaos and crisis hits the fan out there, we can still somehow draw ourselves back into this center that has a sense of being anchored and grounded and connected, and not nearly as much as disturbed as perhaps many people would be, because a lot of people have not cultivated or developed or nurtured an inner life. And that's not a judgment or a criticism, that's just a fact for many people. And so when you've got an over identification with your life existence and your life purpose and who you are, when that identity comes from out there predominantly or only, then when the out there shifts through crisis and chaos, which it is at the moment, then it's like someone's pulled the rug from under your feet and you've got nothing to anchor onto. And so people are desperately trying to hang on to aspects of their life from what's outside of them. And for the most part, a lot of us cannot, because a lot of us are experiencing those aspects of life where they are completely changing form or just being completely removed out of our life, right? And so that's why there is so much value in cultivating some inner life, some introspective processes that you can continuously cultivate and nurture through your life, regardless of your external activities. And so, what I'm suggesting again is that this solar eclipse highlights that opportunity if we so choose to work on those levels. If we don't, we're just going to be primarily blindsided by the Neptune square through the personality mundane level which is going to come through as confusion, deception, disappointment, angst, anxiety, uncertainty, fears, and so forth. That's just what's happening. And finally, before I go, I just want to point to um, it has been my observation that, and I've only looked at Donald Trump, Anthony Fauci, who's not a prime minister or a president, but I just couldn't help but bring him into the picture. So Donald Trump, Anthony Fauci, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, George Bush, Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, John F. Kennedy, all those people except Anthony Fauci were all US presidents. Now I went to the US presidents because they seem to be the most famous, right? I haven't even gone to the Australian, the we call them prime ministers here that we've got. I'm sure they have this aspect that I'm about to show you guys as well, because it seems to me that to become a prime minister or a president, the prerequisite would be, you just got to have a Mercury-Neptune aspect. So, okay, here we go. Donald Trump, Mercury square Neptune. So, without sounding cynical, a Mercury square Neptune, this is not the only level of Mercury square Neptune, right? Let's just be clear. However, a Mercury square Neptune, it is very typical that it will manifest through lies. Person who lies, okay? Like Rob Hand says, manipulating the airways to the expense of others. Okay, now you can say what you want about Donald Trump. I don't care. It doesn't bother me. I'm just pointing to the astrology. That's all. I just want to be clear on that. I'm not speaking about my personal view on Trump or any of these individuals. I'm speaking to the astrological signatures. That's all. Okay, so let's just stay on topic. Anthony Fauci, Mercury at 22 Sag, Neptune 27 Virgo. There's another one with a square aspect. Barack Obama. I was a bit disappointed to see this one because I must admit, even though I'm adding a personal note here, I must admit I do actually, I did like, and I still do like Barack Obama. However, he too has a Mercury-Neptune square aspect in his chart. Joe Biden actually has a Mercury sextile. Now, it's a sextile aspect out of sign, okay, because we need Neptune to be in Virgo, but it's only into 1 degree of Libra. So it's there. It's some might say it's wide. We can split hairs over that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to say, yep, it's a sextile. It's a Mercury-Neptune aspect. George Bush. Let me think. What did he have? Where's Mercury? Mercury sextile. Okay, Mercury sextile Neptune. Okay, there's another Mercury Neptune aspect. Bill Clinton. There's Mercury in Leo. He's another one with a sextile aspect. Okay, because those guys are born around the same sort of time. So yeah. So there's another Mercury-Neptune aspect. Richard Nixon. With Mercury in Capricorn. And this one will be debatable for a lot of people, but I'm going to still bring it in because, so we have Mercury in Capricorn and Neptune's at 24 Cancer, right? And so most people will be inclined to say that's absolutely not an opposition, But let me just say this. In Vedic astrology, aspects are in play when two planets are in the same sign or are in opposite signs. It doesn't matter how far or close they are. Okay, so think about that. Ronald Reagan, Mercury in Capricorn, and where's Neptune? Oh, there we go, opposite Neptune. So there's a clear, with no uncertainty or doubt or arguments, Mercury opposite Neptune. And finally, John F. Kennedy, Mercury in Taurus, and Neptune in Leo. So that's a square aspect, okay? So now you tell me, is that a coincidence? I, just asking you. Is that a coincidence? It's, uh, I heard what's his name? Wayne Dyer, a gentleman who passed away a few years ago, who was big in the movement of self-help and self-development through spiritual teachings, and namely the Tao. He used the Tao a lot in his philosophical, spiritual, cosmological orientation teachings and what he offered. And I heard him say once, and I loved this, and I'll never ever forget it. He said that a coincidence is what people think a coincidence is. The true meaning of it is actually the complete opposite of what we would think. And just briefly from memory, the way he described it was when you break down the word co inside, co inside, right? So this goes back to etymology. So to coincide, co is bringing things together, isn't it, right? So basically coincidence means that, in short, it's simply put, it's two things or more lining up at a particular moment in time, or rather I should say two or more things lining up at the exact precise time and moment that they are supposed to. It's just organic and natural. Right, so coincidence doesn't mean accident, in other words. It's very purposeful. And, when you have, I just highlighted, I think, 6, 7 presidents who all have a Mercury-Neptune aspect, all of them. And that's just looking at a few of them. There's heaps more. There's heaps more American ones. There's lots of other presidents I could have gone to in other countries and so forth. And maybe one day I'll sit there and take the time and do it just to kind of perhaps even expand on this and just show this pattern that seems to be abundantly obvious and clear to me. So interesting food for thought. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully you guys can, just have some more reflections on this current eclipse, and perhaps look at some midpoint structures if you would like to. Perhaps think about, the last 19 years ago, and then the cycle before that, which was in 83. And just share what's going on for you in the comment section under this video. We can all communicate together. I'd be interested to hear how things are going for you relative to perhaps where you are living and your own personal life. Always enjoy interacting with you guys. So thanks again for listening, and I'll be back very soon with more. Much love, much blessings, and see you soon. Bye.